assume they have no commonalities in experience because you don't know anything about that person. So, if you've been a long time follower on this channel, you know full well that I have a strong dislike for the diversity, equity, and inclusion statements. These are statements that surround, what are you going to do to help with diversity, equity, and inclusion, often put in on job applications and becoming increasingly common. So, with respect to university job applications for professors and different positions in a university. But what caught my attention recently was a retake on it in this particular article, in which is what is it? It's the ACS Central Science, which ACS stands for the American Chemical Society here, and this is about crafting policy statements that have a rather unfortunate acronym. A model for crafting diversity, inclusion, respect, and equity policy statements toward catalyzing organizational change. The abstract here. In light of the Black Lives Matter movement, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics community has had to reflect on how their organizations can address their disparities in identity representation. To that end, the ACS Committee on Minority Affairs, CMA, has been called upon to advise various levels of the chemistry enterprise in their interventions, such as structured and actionable policy statements. As a result, this work was created to provide a model for organizations to write catalytic diversity, inclusion, respect, and equity policy statements, DIRE. The model herein acknowledges active tensions and leverages theory, analysis, and practical experiences in an 8-sentence structure completed in 4 steps. It also provides criteria for evaluating and updating existing statements. So, this is not only just a little concerning because you're putting this at a policy level that you want certain things here in, and so I highly doubt that such policy statements would be involving diversity of thought necessarily with respect to diversity, inclusion, respect, and equity here, which is why I don't support these kinds of statements at a policy level either, necessarily, that an institution should be, in line with the Calvin Report, as neutral as possible, and this is decidedly not that. Let's see. I'm not going to read all of this. I don't have the time tonight to read all of this, but I will, of course, provide the link for you. So the synopsis overall is we present a model for STEM organizations to write catalytic diversity, inclusion, respect, and equity policy statements as structured steps for sustained action. You notice this automatically assumes an activist bent here and doesn't presume any disagreement to be allowed with these kinds of things. The opening here is a lot about disparities, though not necessarily anything about why those disparities exist here, save for a few pieces here. What does this go to? Oh, it's blocked. Interesting. I actually clicked on the link here and it's kind of blocked, so I don't know. Oh, that's what that does. Psychology as stereotype and social threat. Interesting. Here. And I don't necessarily have all the time to look through all these such things here, and there's a lot of interesting things here because they're pointing to disparity, and I doubt that there's actually conception here of why some of those disparities exist, or if so, there may be only one treatment of it. One organizational sector where the disparity in identity representation and identity stereotypes has been most prominent is the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Demographics of the STEM workforce is disproportionate to the national average for persons of African, Hispanic, Latinx, and Native Indigenous ancestries. Well, there have been multiple levels of intervention to improve the diversity of the pipeline in STEM, specifically with chemistry practitioners. The number of blacks employed in STEM has only grown from 3.5 to 4.8% from 1993 to 2015. I do not disagree that those disparities exist. The question, of course, is why. Some of those exist, and I don't think necessarily you can presume discrimination. That is the disparity fallacy, as Coleman Hughes points out many times over. Many dire statements fail to initiate climate change or inclusivity as they initiate climate change. I think they mean to say climatic change, as they fail to understand the people and literature that should underpin them. Most are crafted only to be immediate response or position statements and designed to mitigate the blame that is negatively attributed to an organization. Therefore, it is critical for an organization to understand whether their intent is to craft a response statement or a policy statement. The difference in statement types is that response statements offer crisis response strategies. They are communication tools used to respond in the face of a crisis with the primary goal of protecting the organization from legal ramifications. They are not meant to protect, now nor in the future, the persons impacted by the crisis. It is about the organization's bottom line. Policy statements, on the other hand, are realistic and actionable. They are designed to provide direction for the organization as a whole, especially for those who work for it. The intended impact here is long-term. Ownership of the statement is aligned with performance evaluation, leading to change in organizational structure and practices. And this is one of the reasons I don't like these things. How long before your performance evaluation at a university level or an organizational level or in a STEM organization is tied with diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives that have nothing to do with your success as a researcher. I don't support those kinds of things. Your ideology, your personal worldview that goes against the normative principle of universalism to consider your personal worldview as an evaluating criteria with respect to your work and the quality of your work. And so, no, I don't support that because I can see these kinds of dire statements, if you will. And who the hell came up with the idea for the acronym? Because it's really bad phrasing, because the word dire does communicate a huge amount of negativity here. So it's just like good, smart idea to do that. But good grief. Here. Key variables in developing dire statements. Again, bad choice of an acronym. A dire policy statement defines the role of diversity within an organization. It signals internally and externally a specific commitment and strategy toward inclusion and equity. Dire policy statements frame the organization's methodology for building a respectful, engaged climate and outrightly acknowledges the personal and community pain. It communicates that everyone associated with the organization, not just the marginalized groups, are responsible for change. It also assumes a specific worldview, which not necessarily everybody in that organization will share. And if people are evaluated based on a worldview that they do not share, then are you shunting people out of the organization and getting rid of diversity and marginalizing somebody else, perhaps? That is an honest conversation here, Before beginning to craft a dire policy statement, two preliminary notions are framed: need for an environmental scan and understanding the burden. So environmental scan has to do with, has to do with what's going on currently in something, is what they're arguing here. And who bears the burden has to do with the who's going to be creating them, essentially, here. But let's see. Scanning tools, STEM inclusion survey, engineering department level, inclusion level, diversity engagement survey, measuring diversity practice and developing inclusion, organizational personal dimensions. So basically, a lot of these are demographic surveys that you see here, and also probably a question of, do you feel included? Do you really feel included, like you belong, and what have you? Again, not necessarily a relevant kind of guide here. Let's see. Scientific organizations from all employment sectors are examining their methodological and psychological framing around an anti-racist agenda. Again, assuming that the worldview is correct, or assuming that everyone shares the worldview associated with anti-racism, which it should be in quotes because it often seems to be the opposite, is quite their own worldview and not necessarily shared by everybody. So this kind of thing, again, these are why these kinds of statements, I cannot support them, because they do not represent diversity of thought in the slightest. They don't care in the least about viewpoint diversity here. And these will be the kinds of things that shut people up and shut down any diversity of thought with respect to an issue, and respect to, particularly to this kind of issue that is so important, because, these are controversial things that we need to be able to talk about, and survey over survey over survey says that we are scared to talk about it on a university campus, and says that students are scared to talk about it on a university campus. This is not a good way to go about doing it, to actually brand a particular worldview from the top, because everybody who doesn't share that worldview then may very well feel like they have a target on their back. So no, I don't think this is a good idea. These kinds of dire statements, may very well have dire consequences, as it were. Let's see. The goal of using a model for crafting actionable dire policy statements is to catalyze the formation of a more inclusive climate in hopes of forming democratic citizenship where all stakeholders are constantly participating in self-evaluation and awareness of behavior, where the organization is clearly communicating channels for reporting standards, repercussion for violation of these standards, and appropriate safeguards meant to protect all. And I'm going to take a wager this is going to include microaggressions and bias response teams and the whole works there, none of which actually helps with viewpoint diversity, and none of which actually promotes democratic citizenship, because you're afraid to speak your mind on a lot of different things if you're going to be reported for the mighty littlest thing that may be offensive to some people being very few. Yeah, no, that doesn't necessarily help. And I'm going to keep harping on it. This is not thing. Oh, looky. Looky. Critical race theory is here. Frameworks underpinning the model. 2 frameworks underpin the model for the dire policy statement. Theoretical frameworks for understanding human interactions, critical race theory X? What is theory XYZ? And symbolic interaction perspective, and organizational frameworks informed by decision-making theory, the ethic model of decision-making, and the garbage can model. Critical race theory plays a pivotal role here, and critical race theory is a contemporary look at the intersections of perceptions of communities of color on race and systemic sources of maintaining power structures. It explores marginalization dynamics and scenarios and appropriate methods for removing and addressing identity-specific perceptions of stereotypes, judgments, or restrictions, such as increasing concentrations of similar but diverse identities. Other aspects of applying the theory have suggested, including acknowledging solution interest convergence, asset and not deficit building focus, recognizing variability in ethnicity, race, group effects, and perception of policies and spaces, effect evaluation of policies and procedures leading to reconstruction to remove systemic favoring toward majority identities. It highlights the concepts of conflict and power and assumptions of human motivations at work. Critical race theory makes a crap ton of assumptions, and I've talked about how critical race theory is fundamentally anti-STEM, anti-science, period, on this channel before. That is a prior video. But basically, because critical race theory assumes only some people can have knowledge of something, which goes against the idea of communality, that scientific knowledge belongs to all, critical race theory primarily assumes that, hey, you have to be judged differently on the basis of your race because these things supposedly happened to you, or you were part of this oppressed identity. That goes against the principle of universalism. Disinterestedness, critical race theory has an activist component, actively tries to change things. It cannot be unbiased in its own fashion there, but yeah, it doesn't do research for the pursuit of the truth. It does research for the pursuit of an activist agenda, which it violates the norm of disinterestedness. And organized skepticism, you're not allowed to challenge anything that comes from somebody if they're of a particular identity, whereas organized skepticism means that you should be challenging and rigorously scrutinizing anything, regardless of the person's identity. Or, as they put it, identity. What they mean really here is immutable characteristics with race, sex, gender, and what have you, and that's not necessarily useful at all. Evident are the feelings of insecurity experienced by persons in an organization absent a critical mass of people from diverse identities. What? That is a sentence that doesn't even need to be there. Wait, hold it. The interconnectedness assumptions of critical race theory and identity threat can be further explained by McGregor's organization theory on beliefs and motivation. McGregor's theory X assumes participants in institutions dislike work and thus must be coerced toward achievement. Okay, McGregor's theory Y conversely assumes humans are self-directed and practice self-control in service only to clear objectives to which they're committed and that of which the institution shares. Participants are therefore able to contribute creatively to solutions of the organization's problems if they are invested in the inherent good of the institution and all in it. Ochi's theory Z emphasizes collective decision-making and responsibility. Theory Z centers on three tenets. I believe that you understand my point of view. I believe that I understand your point of view. And whether or not I understand the decision, I will support it because it was arrived at in a fair and open manner. Together, these three motivations about work, theory X, Y, and Z, frame biased perceptions of people and work fueling pain points. Right. Okay. Interesting. I did not know there was a McGregor's Theory X. This is fascinating because I don't think people realize. I wonder if any of these theories actually recognize the idea of a person having a telos, an ultimate purpose, which is to say they seek something that is fulfilling for their lives. And yeah, you're going to dislike it if it's not necessarily being fulfilling in your own purpose for your life. So there's a whole lot of things there. Goodness. Yeah, interconnectedness assumptions. You gotta, I'm glad they at least say it, that critical race theory has a crap ton of assumptions in it. And critical race theory's primary assumption is that racism isn't everything and it's all about power. In here, critical race theory's first tenet assumes that racism is present everywhere. It is not a matter of if racism happened in any interaction. It is a matter of how did it manifest itself in the situation, is what critical race theory assumes all the time. Which is why it part of the reason why it inherently violates the principle of universalism. Let's see here. Purpose, position, methodology, actions, measurement. So this is their model for crafting this kind of stuff. So let's see. Step 1, the purpose examines the problem, people, and core values of the organization. Much of this is collected from the environmental scan and evaluation of burdens. The purpose or position information is compiled into one sentence. There's a typo. The first step asks the statement developers to consider what is the problem being solved, who are the people affected, and what is the system. Okay. Position and methodology considers the answers from step 1 to frame the position and methodology. Review and answer the questions alongside one's organization's core values and rewards system. Step 3 is action and measurement. The action and measurement names the metrics and locale of work as 3 sentences, figure 4. This third step calls for the statement developer to consider sanctions in step 2, methods proposed, plan for regular monitoring, and provisions to make the statement actionable. Consider reviewing where performance or evaluations are often done, what rewards are in place, and what metrics for employees for their organization's time and effort, and the recognition may be needed. So if you're wondering, this is where I would be concerned about, is this going to lead, these kinds of dire statements lead to changes to performance evaluations which incorporate things that people of different worldviews would not be willing to do and would go against their own conscience. That's an issue that I would have with these things, and I have not had a sufficient answer as to whether or not these things actually take into account diversity of thought and difference of worldview when you're in here, and, that you should not be judging based upon any of those things, really. Though that is a bit of the normative principles of science talking through me. But the moral question there is, do you really think you have the right to engage in a performance evaluation based upon something that is your own worldview rather than an objective measure, or a measure that is based upon a biased worldview at this point? And that's what I get concerned about with some of these kinds of things that are crafted into policy. Scope and reach sentences list the affected stakeholders' participation, energy, terminology, and decision-making, and are the last 2 sentences. The section states explicitly the groups included or excluded in the policy. So in other words, some groups can be excluded from the dire policy statement, some groups can be included. Care should be taken not to include the most recent identity terminology and ensure the language does not further marginalize affected people. Language examination or requirement for political correctness in speech and text policy statements may appear at the nascent stage when when discussing microaggressions, slights, and identity first, or critical discourse to some. The reverse is true, as monocultural communication has permeated our history, forcing us to see the other as outside our genre and discourse because they do not fit our style or semiotic way of being. The legal field and disability conventions around personhood have long required self-checking of proper language use or attention to language that invalidates, though well-intentioned or subtle in form, as it still discriminates. That sentence made no damn sense. Writers familiar or uncomfortable with the pitfalls should include input from their organization's support units or partners responsible for cultural competency and applicable governing laws. So yeah, separation, disclaimer, streams of decision-making. So, as a result, these different pieces of the model are synthesized into one continuous paragraph. The compilation of the 4 steps brings together a complete policy statement that is actionable throughout the organization's strategies. So in other words, this is a thing that does not just dictate what's going on, not just the virtue signaling statement of we think this and we stand this and what have you, but this is a statement that builds upon action. And this is why this concerns me, because actions centered around a particular policy centered around a particular worldview will end up inherently alienating a lot of people from the other worldview who do not agree with this kind of crazy nonsense. And again, this is why wokeness is not a good idea to have institutionalized in policy, because you're inherently throwing people out who disagree with you. So this is an example. At Organization X, to maintain an inclusive workplace, we see no place for racism in our workplace, name organization. Do not condone discrimination of any kind. This statement affects all employees as we value the rights, dignity, voice, and worth of all employees. We provide a dire unit and reporting mechanisms to voice both successes and failures in support of these values to be reviewed annually, but efforts to be inclusive and equitable in our practices is ongoing, and suggestions are welcomed anonymously via Dropbox. Actions taken via this statement include the addition of 2 metrics. A metric added to all employee and performance evaluations for engagement in and support of DIRE. Again, you're forcing people to do something they do not agree with and may not have the same, because they don't have the same worldview. That is not respecting diversity and inclusion in all these kinds of things, as much as they want to claim otherwise. They are utterly getting rid of diversity of thought. That's why this is not a good idea to embrace in these kinds of things. You are shunting away people who disagree because they disagree, because you are forcing them to do something that goes against their own conscience in a lot of ways. Usually it doesn't end well when you do that. They don't have to be there. I mean, if you're employed at will kind of thing, that's the situation. But good grief. 2, a metric added to the organization's annual evaluation of success for the support of an inclusive climate. Sanctions for violation of this policy can include up to the loss of employment. There it is. This policy governs all groups impacted disproportionately by diversity, equity, and inclusion, and upholds existing policy supporting the same in compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. All members can aid in decision-making, as organization climate is all our collective responsibility. I hope they remember the Civil Rights Act of 1964 forbids discriminating on the basis of race kind of thing, or sex or gender, or what have you, because this is not necessarily a great thing. So, concluding remarks. Let's get to the end here. DIRE policy statements give context for leadership conversations around inclusivity, meaningful engagements, and intersection of identities, race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, religion, and other social identities. Notice they always go with identities, that dehumanizing bowl of identities. I have one identity, thank you very much. I don't have many identities. And you don't get to define that I have many identities. I have one identity. Thank you very much. Good grief. I would not work for somebody who has one of these damn statements. I'd be pissed. In fact, I will not work for somebody who has any. I will not willingly engage in work with anybody Okay. I will not work for a company that has one of these. I will not I would not rule out working with a company in my own capacity as my own person setting my own rules. If that company had a DIRE statement, that's fine. I wouldn't necessarily rule them out that way because they're allowed to have their own beliefs, and that's fine. But I wouldn't work for that company. I would not be an employee of that company, that STEM organization that had one of these. Dire policy statements also help organizational leaders communicate and lead discussions when sensitive topics infringe on the perception of rights-based actions around respectful justice. As organizations embark on the task of using this model, they should remember that leadership characteristics and organization structure influence dire policy statement adoption. As authors are following the model, they should take care to integrate language toward equitable practices within all aspects of organization and strategies. Again, what the heck is equity and equitable? And you're probably meaning equality of outcomes, which is not necessarily achievable anyway. Finally, the best way to ensure effective and actionable dire policy statements is to include all levels of representation in decision-making. Not all minority groups are the same, and while they may share some commonalities in experience, they cannot have the responsibility of speaking for all. How about you assume they don't have the same commonalities in experience? This is what's one of the things that's sickening to me about this woke ideology and why it has no place in science, as far as I'm concerned, is they immediately assume, although they're trying not to say it, they're trying to wiggle around it, they immediately assume may share some commonalities in experience, they cannot have the responsibility. No. Assume they have no commonalities in experience because you don't know anything about that person. You have absolutely no knowledge about that person aside from what they look like. You have no way of knowing whether or not they are supposedly oppressed or marginalized or anything like that. They may be very welcome in there and have no problem at all. You have absolutely no way of knowing that. And to make the assumption that somebody is something on the basis of race, sex, gender, what have you, is some of the most bigoted things I have ever seen come out of this nonsense. It's why I can't stand it with some of these dire statements. These dire statements are very dire statements indeed. They're so full of crap. They also cannot bear the burden of the entire burden of an inclusive climate alone. While having long-term dire progress, this process of crafting the policy statement can often give often marginalized stakeholders a platform for their voice to be heard, their pain to be acknowledged, and their perspectives to be included within the shared organizational values. We learn more and expand our perspectives by having others with different identities with a voice at the decision-making table. This diversity of thought and perspective will also help the crafting process to remain ethical and transparent. Therefore, it is imperative that organizations adopt this inclusive model as a guide through crafting an actionable, inclusive, and viable dire policy statement. Okay. One thing I want to point out here. At the same time as they assume common identities, they are also assuming the opposite. That somebody who just looks different immediately has a different point of view and perspective on something. And while that may be true, that is not necessarily always constantly true. But that is the assumption that is made here when you're saying with different identities having a voice at the decision-making table, because often with identities, they are referring to race, sex, gender, and what have you. And just assuming they're going to have a different point of view just because they look different from me. It is one of the most bigoted and disgusting things I've ever seen. And I'm not going to be shy about saying it. That is not respecting diversity of thought in the slightest. That is not respecting diversity. That is not respecting humanity, the humanity of a person either. That is absolutely dehumanizing. It's probably one of the most dehumanizing things to assume that you know what somebody has thought or experienced, things or experiences, just because of what they look like. The truth is, you have no idea. And this is one reason by itself why I would never support one of these dire policy statements if they're constructed with this idea in mind that, I know what you think, I know what you've been through just because I know what you look like. And again, so another thing I'm going to add to my list, I don't like DEI statements. They're ideological litmus tests. I definitely don't like these kinds of dire statements, in particular because of what I just said, but also because if it starts affecting performance evaluations, you're evaluating somebody on something that they are uncomfortable doing as part of, it may very well conflict with their own worldview. And you've institutionalized a particular worldview as the top of the policy, when that's not necessarily a good thing. That's it for now. Dire policy statements are very dire indeed. That's it. So if you like this video, hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz. Don't forget to come on over to Locals and join us for some fun. And we'll have a good old time. with a lot of different things going on here. Thursday review this week is going to be on the attractiveness of face masks, actually. Apparently, you're more attractive, according to a study, if you're wearing a face mask to deal with COVID. We're going to have fun ripping apart that study. But from that on, I think I've got another couple of things to do for tomorrow. And that's it for now. Until next time, I'm Adrian, and I hope you stay curious, my friends.